now, as I said, already and very, very privileged to have Billy Thomas with us, the man who knows more about telephones than a yellow pages and a telephone directory combined. And he's going to be talking specifically about the development of telephone area boundaries in Camden. So, Billy, if I can hand over to you and said, really looking forward to your talk.
Yes, so good evening, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity, really, to talk. And it's really great as well to share a lot of the social history that has come through. So the history and development of telephone area boundaries in Camden will be the topic of my talk this evening, and hopefully bringing you lots of nostalgia as well. So, just a brief introduction about myself, really. So, my name is Billy. I have an interest in the history of telephones. I'm also part of the Telecommunication Heritage Group. So, that encompasses that group. A lot of interest historians, I suppose, if you like, such as myself, people who've worked in telecom operators. So, it's a real good source of information that we all share. And I've also got my own specialist interest. And what I did with all of those, because there's lots of information and facts, I made my own Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, which is, derived instantly from Instagram, really. And that's to help me remember all the facts. And it's just brilliant that I can share this now and find people's stories. And I'd quite like you all to take a moment now to have your own numbers, landline numbers in your head. You can even write them down, obviously keep them to yourselves, but have a little idea of what your number was, because I would guarantee you over the years you will notice a pattern somewhere in there historically of your telephone numbers. And then questions, obviously, I'm more than happy to try my very best to answer at the end. So welcome. This evening, I'll be talking about early telecommunications, the area codes in Camden and how they came about, because obviously we know a lot of area codes tended to be with locations, but you will find out some of them got a little bit busy, so some more had to be added. Telephone exchanges we'll be looking at specifically in Camden, and as an enthusiast as myself, I go to see the architect of the telephone exchanges, which are pretty magnificent. So there's lots of great pictures that we will look through tonight, and lots of telephone exchanges fitting in with the areas. We'll also be looking at the speaking clock in Holborn. That was first recorded in 1936, so that's quite a historic telephone exchange. And then obviously we'll look at the operator recruitment. And then finally, summarising my talk, we'll be looking at some shop fronts and some trade directory adverts, how those numbers have extended over time. So before I begin, this gentleman here, Alexander Graham Bell, in 1876, working in Massachusetts for the School of Deaf, he discovered that sound waves could be pushed through a wire, and he was starting to hear all of this communication. And obviously, that was a real poignant time. And Alexander Graham Bell, he lived 1842 to 1922. He was a Scottish-born inventor. In 1876, as I mentioned, he discovered the use of the telephone. It was quite a feat then. Lots of people were discovering, and it's like with all good inventors, nobody really knows who came up with the idea first. But in 1881, Alexander Graham Bell painted the telephone, but not just the telephone, the twisting of two copper wires. And then this led to it being, preserved, really, not to be copied. So looking at early telephones then, this is where it all kind of started. So we can see this lady here's got what we know as a Gower Bell telephone from the 1900s. And it was just a row of houses that might have had it. It was a very personal service. So you would have your telephone operator upstairs, which probably would be your neighbour, and it was just a very simple. Mainly the wealthy had them, and as you can see, she's got a speaking tube and a receiver there. So although it did have bells, there was no, you just picked up and you got straight through to your operator. But then an important part of legislation came in because all of these separate companies were coming up with their own ideas for the telephone, and all these companies were trying to steal each other, trying to get competition. So in 1911, the Telegraph Act combined all of those smaller telephone companies in London to form the GPO and put up a network, to put up, the telephone poles, the distribution, the footway covers, for example. And in Temple Lane Embankment in Victoria is the headquarters, really, where it was kind of formed. All of these kind of ideas and this legislation was pushed through. So I've taken a little bit of a source to really sink in and understand the act. So it's the Telegraph Act construction. 1868 was the initial, but obviously it's had amendments over time. So it was an act to facilitate the construction and maintenance of telegraphic lines, enacted by the King's Most Excellent Majesty, by and with the consent of the Lords Spiritual and Temporal and Commons in this present Parliament assembled, and the authority of the same as follows. Where the Postmaster General has constructed or desires to construct a telegraphic line along the street or public road, or said line crosses or is carried over, upon, or under, or is in his opinion expedient that the said line shall cross or be carried over, upon, or under a railway or a canal, the Postmaster General may enter upon that railway or canal for the purpose of maintaining or altering the said telegraphic line, if already constructed, or as the case may be, for the purpose of placing the said telegraphic line thereon, either overhead or underground. And the GPO set up a lot of strict guidelines. It had to be a certain distance over the road, same with the buildings. So the height had to be, really worked, and there were manuals for the engineers as well. So this is a very early map now, looking at the London telephone area. So great, they've got that legislation pushed through. So it, you need exchanges, because the exchanges held the switchboards to divert people. And it wasn't just in straight lines now, it was all over London. So we can see city exchanges and West End exchanges started to pop up all over London, started to really build fast pace, to keep up with the service. And obviously GPO, the General Post Office, it was a government ministerial role until 1969. So at then, obviously, it was a lot of the public funds that were put into it, really. But yeah, you can see the city exchanges and the West End exchanges. And I'd like you to take note of Holborn Telephone Exchange, which is obviously, as we know, one of the Camden ones. So this is a very old historic exchange, kind of and you had these simple numbers. Again, not a lot of equipment. Equipment was developing, so you could just pick it up and normally it'd be straight through to the operator, causing a queue and people to get very frustrated on the line. So I've circled the kind of area that we're looking at here, but obviously there's quite large areas to accommodate for such, diverse amount of traffic for the area. So Almond Brown Strowger, he was an American inventor, and he played a really important part in making the telephone service propel, if you like. So he patented the automatic selector in 1891. He noticed his competitor's wife and operated, switching all calls away from his undertaker business, which was in Kansas, America. So obviously he rightfully thought, this is not fair. I'm not getting business. Yeah, there's a bias here. So Almond Strowger developed the Strowger switch, a switching and selecting step for numbers. And this is really vitally important because it worked with the telephone dial to the exchange equipment. So it was first introduced into London in 1920s and installed by the GPO engineers to help direct call to selected telephone exchanges. Rather than just going to the one now, we had post exchanges, little tandem exchanges to help with all of that sorting. So 1927, the director equipment from Strowger was pretty much all up and running. Most exchanges and even the little post exchanges that were just built, some, prefab built until, they could make an exchange whilst they're waiting for the building. So the exchange codes were given to specific exchanges. So they all had an identity number, if you so wish. And then the area codes were a sequence of numbers given to a location. The number dialed then got a line extension using a uniselector as part of this director equipment. So it's all these kind of selectors where literally you have a rotor and it would select your number in a sequence. So the first code selector at the nearby exchange selected your first number. So for example, the first code selector, 4. Then that would be sent to a tandem exchange. Now these tandem exchanges weren't exchanges for the public. They were just more to carry a number, if you so wish, down a certain street, because we're getting all of these different areas now that people want to call. So the tandem exchanges use the second selector for the first number, and then the third selector would type in or select that number. And it was all electromagnetism at that time. So that's kind of how those selectors were pushed to be worked, really, until electricity and things developed for the telephone exchange. The destination exchange would then use a numerical selector for the incoming call. But we had an issue because obviously you've got all those area codes and that's lovely. Everybody knows where they're calling to, but telephone traffic increased, creating holdups, and therefore exchanges to having needing to have more than one area code. So the additional secondary selector equipment was built in. Engineers would come in, and this is why exchanges are quite big, because they need the floor plan. They work along a floor plan to put in all of this equipment. So as the different lines were becoming more popular to different areas, they needed to set them up, really, these area codes pretty quickly and let subscribers know their new number to call. So tandem exchanges help to continue the journey of these new lines and routing digits to the required exchange. So it's that sequence of your area code, if you so wish. Now, on your telephone dial, or back then, you would have had letters, but they corresponded to numbers. So they were a bit like a letter number combination. And the letters were really to help people find, or subscribers, find where they were calling to. So letters were used to help subscribers find destinations, and that worked really well for the original ones. But this is where it becomes interesting. The GPO then had to think up new area codes, which is why some area codes we still don't really understand today. So the GPO used native phonetic alphabet to come up with various combinations that were available. Now, the GPO had all of this, they'd had just World War One, World War Two coming around the corner potentially. So a post office defense network could really trace calls back. So they could really find out who was calling, particularly if that line, was hacked into by a spy, for example, that they could determine where it was. So the phonetic alphabet was used as a general. It's not perfect because it wouldn't fit exactly in, but it was used as kind of a guideline. So these words were used to match to known locations or road names where possible. Sometimes that couldn't be. So they would just have to make a word that fitted in a sequence of numbers that would sound logical to a lot of people, so they would know. And this is hence why we get things like Juliet and Gulliver and all these area codes we may have not heard of. And we will go through the area codes a bit later in my talk. But it is quite fascinating how they've developed all of it. So here we are, we have a telephone dial, and this is one from my collection, and you can see here we've got all of the letters corresponding to their number. Now, the telephone dial only used 24 letters in total. That is because O was for operator, so that was already used. Q and Z were too similar. Q was said to look like an O, and Z was not really many words that you can make out of a Z that people would find easy enough to remember. That was the logic from the GPO anyway. So it was used in groups of 3, as you can see, because if you have all of your numbers areas as groups of 3, they're the same size, they can all go through the selector, happy days. But of course, if you might notice M and N are on their own, and that's because O was for the operator. That's another logical O for operator to help people out. Particularly back then, reading wasn't people's strength. There was still, some of them couldn't afford to go to school. We're talking 1910 at that specific time. So as we can see here, this is from one of my 1950s telephone directories. So we can see all of these letter codes. Some are using their full name because to make it easy for subscribers to identify. Some are just using a 3-letter code that you could use. So typically they would go for Primrose Hill, for example. So PRI would be your code. But then, because that area might need 2 area codes, other areas came in. What can they make logical for people to understand? What's going to help people identify the different areas? And here we have a very long list. It's about 175 plus from the GPO, all of the area codes in London at that specific time. So this is obviously from the 1950s. And you can see they're highlighted in bold, the first 3 letters, because that matched on the telephone dial. And of course, in the selector equipment, if they're all the same size, we're not going to get a delay because there might be another call waiting, because the selectors could only process kind of 1 area code or 1 call at a time. So we can see they're all down here. Some you'll be familiar with, and some, for example, Gulliver, you may not have heard particularly before, or something like, let's have another little look. Juliet, that's another particular one in the area of Camden I'm using, because I've been focusing a lot on Camden, but there's a lot of different area codes there that, you may have heard of, you may have not heard of. Tudor, for example, that was quite a popular one. But yeah, and I've kind of drawn on a little map almost for the different lines that were all traveling over London. They could cross each other, absolutely. And that's when you would need a tandem exchange to pass it over, if you like, pass that baton over to get through to the different streets, the different areas. For example, Hampstead, Primrose Hill, we've got lots of these different routes, if you so wish, that they travel along. And they did become hold-ups, but because of the GPO's very clever administrator, they could track calls. Where's this problem happening? Because very quickly you would get a build-up of people getting very angry, very, waiting on the lot, calling up to complain. So it was really important. A lot of that was monitored and tracked. And we've got Hampstead. So these are just a few. Maida Vale. So again, we're just using those 3 capital letters, which were a letter number combination. So the GPO were always very it's a telephone service for the people. It was really, really important that it was user friendly. Primrose Hill. So those were the sorts of areas. And then London alone had to kind of be on their own, if you like, because it was such a huge service. Any more coming into it would just cause mayhem. So the London Telephone Service kind of was born then, really. It was split into areas for London. So you had different areas managing, dealing with accounts, engineers, sales, services, and of course the telephone bills. They had to be quite accurate there. So you had the centre, city, east, north, northwest, southeast, southwest, and west area. So that's how it was all split up. It was 28 boroughs included at this specific time. As I mentioned, 175 plus area codes. So there's a lot of area codes going on. And how they made it all individual is beyond me. And a great example of this is 999. When it came around in 1937, they decided on 999, partly because there was incidents, where people were dying, they needed to have a priority call system. But 999 is not used a lot. So actually it's quite separate from a lot of numbers. Not a lot of number have the area codes 9 in them. So that was specifically, and then obviously for the subscriber, we know 9 is the last one on the dial. So that was nice and easy. So they were making it a service, if you so wish, for the public. It was a two-tier system. So you had the Greater London Council managing the city, and then, of course, the local boroughs managing the local telephone service. So, if somebody had driven into a telephone pole, for example, that might need to be mended, particularly, if anything of those sorts happened. And then the billing would be done by your telephone area for that, London. And then this allowed them, so they had these area codes. This then allowed them to map out all of the different bands for the telephone charges. So they could send you a lovely bill. And we can see here the exchanges within the 5 miles radius of Oxford of Circus would be a prime call. And that was because their telephone switchboards were the most busiest. So we can see here how they have banded all of this was in miles, how far you were ringing out. And that's all in pence at that specific time. And then the charge ring. And then later on, it became apparent that sometimes you had peak traffic, sometimes non-peak traffic. So, 6 and weekends, it tended to be when you could call and get a cheaper call, but, because it was less popular at that time to call. And in the exchanges, they had these subscriber meters. So this would meter each individual subscriber, how long they were on the line for, how far distance call. So this is working off a slave clock. And ultimately, this is what would send your accurate bill. It would still have to be typed out on a typewriter, or the typists would send you a lovely bill. It would all be done by post then, handwritten. It would need to be stamped, approved by the Postmaster General, and then that would be sent to your subscriber's address. A lot of households started to invest in Smith's timers. That some of you might recognize, but this was in the home really, for the different bands. So you could put the timer on when you're on the call to have an idea how much is it going to cost you, because obviously back then rationing had just finished, unemployment was at an all-time high, so they really needed to watch their money and their savings. So a lot of people had this sat next to the phone, which the GPO brought out, if you so wish, for the different bands. And we can see A, B, and C there as well. So it can tell you how long, and that was for the distance of your call. So we're now going to look at the London Borough of Camden specifically. And again, this is quite nice because hopefully it can bring lots of nostalgia. You may have seen some of these buildings. So we had Hampstead and Swiss Cottage. Again, I've put them in the capitals, as they so would be in the directory and on your dial cards rather. So that would all, be a letter number combination. So from the subscriber's point of view, it's just an area. So that was really important that was kept. We've got King's Cross, so that served Brunswick and Terminus area codes. Maida Vale and Kilburn. Kentish Town and Gulliver. So again, some of these area names are not used anymore. So you may have heard them. Where they could, they tried to match them to streets and landmarks, but it wasn't always possible with the word available, because they were going down the alphabet, really, that NATO phonetic alphabet, to try and find these area codes. What can we use? What makes sense and is completely different from all numbers, or all the different area codes. So we had Euston, for that was for Ewell and Fairlands. Holborn and Chancery, which is obviously a very historic, one of the first telephone exchanges. And we're going to look very closely at Holborn as well a little bit later on, because Holborn holds particular value, with the speaking clock in 1936. So we'll come on to that. Primrose Hill and Juniper. So we've got Museum, Langham and Meredith as well. So that was quite historic. So we're going to look now at these specific telephone exchanges that formed part of Camden. And this is where I'd like you to look at your numbers, particularly if you're from that area, because I guarantee you it will probably be after the first 4 digits. You will have had these original area codes still in your number today. Most likely. The only reason you wouldn't is because when it turned all to Stroud, some of the area codes were dropped. So Euston Telephone Exchange was built in 1932. It was on Euston Road. The architecture was all from the government, really. So the architect was Eric Bedford from the Ministry of Public Works and Architects Department. And it served codes Euston, Faylands, Ewell, Farningham and Farnborough. And you can see the codes here. They had two area codes. And if you look at those area codes, there's two separate switchboards, if you like, for all of your different other codes, if you so wish. So 322, 380, 383, 387, 388, 391, 393, 484, 644, 689, and 728 was served. So those are just a select few. I mean, as you can imagine, telephone switchboards could take up to 10,000 numbers. So I've just picked out some really that you can look at. And as my interest portails, I go out and look at the architects and look at the buildings, because that's all incorporate, definitely in the telephone service. And it was great because if we look at this little letterbox here, we can see the Post Office London Telephone Service. So that's a nice little relic of the past. And they were definite working buildings. So the GPO had floor plans A to J to house all of the equipment. So they had to really have a floor plan, but then the architects would add their own signature pieces, if you so wish, to fit in with the area, because they're quite ugly buildings, if I'm honest. That red brick is quite stands out. You can't miss a telephone exchange, but that also red brick was there made to last. These have been here throughout the Second World War, a lot of them, and a lot of them went into underground, some of them, to keep vital lines open at that specific time. So you can see lots of features above the door. It's all very fitting into, as I say, 1932 with that era and style. And if we look some of the windows, particularly in the bottom left, a lot of them have ventilation. Now, that's not an error. That's supposed to be there. And that's because the switchboards got very hot, funny enough, and heat, really affected these telephone exchanges, and light as well. At that specific time, the lead wiring, that, the sheathing, if you like, did become affected. So they had dust to contend with. They had obviously all the ventilation. So they had a lot of factors to consider in. And the one in the top right, looks like it would hold a sign, and I can visualize, because I've seen lots of photos, that would have had a post office telephone sign or a telephone exchange here to let people know where it is, because at that time bills were still put through to your nearest exchange. So Hampstead Telephone Exchange we'll look at now. So this was on Finchley Road, 1909. This was designed by architect Leonard Stokes, who was an Edwardian architect. So the codes were Hampstead and Swiss Cottage. And then from that, some of the other codes were 426, 433, 435, and 794. So it was, again, an Edwardian GPO design, so it had to fit in. And if you've ever seen it, it's magnificent. It really was. It took me away almost, because you can start to see some of these nice features that were elsely included, and telephone exchange, it was a part of the government. So it's a government building, really. So at that time, that's why it kind of stood out and hold the monarchy, really. And if we have a little look again, some of these windows have got ventilations, and that was because air, ventilation shafts in the building, and to protect some of that equipment, from getting too overheated. You don't want too much dust settling. And again, it's still got the features. And I think on the larger photo, we've got, well, it looks like a royal cipher for King George V. Um, so again, ciphers would have changed on the buildings, and because it was part of the sovereignty and obviously the British Empire at that time as well, we had India and Australia exporting our telephones out there as well, and some of those countries still use that today. And whilst I was doing my research, interestingly enough, I came across this that was mentioned in the House of Parliament, and this is just brilliant. So I'll read this out. So, whether he is aware that the manager of the Hampstead Telephone Exchange has specifically refused to subscriber 1253, so that's a subscriber's number, any definite informal iron as to the cause of the delay of 20 minutes upon Sunday, the 11th of October, last, during which delay the exchange, though there was no breach in the electrical communication between it and the subscriber, failed to attend to his call. And will he say what action he proposed to take in the matter? So it sounds like he's just knocked the telephone off the hook or hasn't put the telephone back. Very simple error. But of course, because the dial worked with the equipment, it's going to hold up a lot of the equipment in the exchange for other calls. They'll be waiting on the line. There could be important lines coming through. And obviously, as I mentioned, in 1937, it was only then they got the emergency priority call throughs. So, it could have been a vital line that they were waiting for. So we're now going to look at Holborn Telephone Exchange, one of the most poignant ones or poignant ones in history, really, for the telephone world, if you so wish. So this was, again, architects from the HM Office of Works. It used the code Holborn and Chancery. One of the first telephone exchanges, as you remember in that map that I showed you at the beginning, served codes 242, 269, 379, 404, 405, 492, 611, and 831. And the speaking clock was recorded here by Jane Ethel Kane in 1936. Now, the speaking clock came about really to stop people going out at night when it was most risky, taking up a policeman's time, keep asking, what is the time? So they could just do it from home. That's why it came about, really. And also, clocks were quite expensive then, so it was a lot easier for the whole of the United Kingdom. And this image here is a great image because it's Jane Ethel Kane, and she's accepting 10 guineas from the Postmaster General, George Tryon, at that specific time. For the award. And interestingly, I watched the documentary Dial B for Britain. And in that documentary, it mentioned Jane Ethel Kane had a lisp. So although she was already chosen at that time to be the speaking clock voice, they wanted to refuse it. They wanted to start again. But it had already gone out, the advertising. So it was said that lessons were given to her on how to speak. But we know a lisp is not, it's not being very inclusive now, looking back at it. But that's just an interesting little anecdote I picked up there. So 1936, as I say, Jane Ethel Kane recorded all of this at the Holborn Telephone Exchange. She wasn't from Holborn, she was from Croydon Telephone Exchange. So she came down. Tim 846 was the speaking clock number. Jane Ethel Kane won from 15,000 operators to be selected, won 10 guineas as a prize, and the opportunity to record at each time interval for all of the recorded times. So 79, and it was recorded on these full blast discs, and they all had rotors on and movement, so they all aligned, for that recording of that time. And that was quite, groundbreaking at that time for that, really. And you can see Jane Ethel Kane there in the photo. And then just some pictures. So it's a really kind of artisan design, we're talking, 1914, really early. So we've got some of the real historic features within that. And it's quite well known, so well known, in fact, it's now the BT Archive Centre, and you can book a table there, look at historical artifacts. That's my next thing to do, definitely, to go along and to book, reserve a table space, because I think it would be fascinating. And obviously, not too far, we know the Kingsway, underground tunnels there were used, really, when Holborn Telephone Exchange had to go underground in World War II for vital lines to keep them open because it was important. They could report bomb damage, or you could tell your air raid warden or precaution warden, where the bombs had hit. So it was important that the calls got through. Kentish Town Telephone Exchange we'll look at then. So the codes for Kentish Town and Gulliver, located on Kelly Road. It served codes 267, 284, 482 and 485. So the architect was Archibald Scott in 1929. And this was interesting because the GPO was starting to select architects that they approved of. Outside architects, but again, they would need to follow a strict floor plan to fit all of the equipment in. Each floor, if you like, on the telephone exchange is for switchboards. You'd have a canteen up the top. It was a working building, a toilet, staff offices, and a car park at the back as well. So we can see some images here, and at the front we can see the older existing telephone exchange and then the newer one put on the back. Now, when Strowger fully came about, which then you didn't need an operator for because even the subscribers number could go through, a lot of them moved just across the road, or some of them, would have these extensions on. And then you've got your vehicular access there. So King's Cross, Terminus and Brunswick area codes. It was located on Gray's Inn Road and Harrison Street Road because when it formed for Strowger, it moved just across the road to a bigger site potentially. So this was architect John Hatton Markham of HM Office of Works. The codes served were 278, 387, 833, 837 and 843. So that's just some of those. And this is one of my favourite designs. You've got this real electric blue kind of stand out. So it's a real impressive building. And if we notice here, we've got the candlestick telephone. And that's probably because part of the British Empire, in those days when we had India, Australia, we were exporting a lot of telephones out to those sorts of countries from Britain. We were a real developer. We had GPO factories, 4 in total, all over the UK. And we can see, candlestick was a real feature because it was pre-dial, dial, some of it was just hooked up to the operator. It's a really adaptable telephone, the candlestick. And then in 1976, they made the candlestick from old candlesticks. So there's even more candlesticks out there. So they're still just as popular today as for that improvement of the telephone. Museum telephone then, exchange. So this opened in 1914, converted to automatic in 1944, and then in 1950 became a control centre, for your real long distance calls. So the architect was John Rutherfield of HM Office Works. Codes Museum, Langham and Meredith, and then codes were 255, 268, 323, 436, 580, 612, 631, 632, 636, 637, and 687. So if you can see that somewhere in your number, if you're from that particular area. And interestingly enough, this exchange moved to now where the post office tower is. So this is really kind of where it started, the long distance. And you'll notice this trunk control center for the switching really played an important part. And we can see again some images here from the outside that I've taken. And what's lovely to see is I've seen this particular scrolls on the doors before. So Victoria and Pimlico Telephone Exchange have that as well. So there's obviously a little piece of the architect, from the same architect for, following a floor plan, if you so wish. And then there's just some more images there as well from that. And it's listed. So there's quite a lot of information to read about on this. Maida Vale. Codes for Maida Vale and Kilburn, the architect, GPO, HM Office of Works, and then the codes served were as followed as well: 372, 547, 604, 624, and 625. And we can see here on the picture on the left, we've got the older existing telephone behind, and then the new extension, probably for that new equipment to be housed on the front there as well. which is a bit of a shame because you can't really see it, but um, it's still got the evidence, of the blacked out windows, the ventilation within that as well. And then you can also see these winch doors as well. That's how they would put all of the equipment in, through these doors on the side for that particular floor. So if you think of each floor as like a switchboard for a certain area. Primrose Hill Telephone Exchange then served codes Primrose Hill and Juniper. The architects were in the HM Office of Works, located on Townshend Road, and the codes, some of them were 483, 586, and 722. And again, this is a particularly interesting one because the brick is different, presumably to fit more in with the area. It had two entrances, one for the telephone operators at that time, and then one for the engineers as well. Why it was made like that, I'm not sure. But as you can see, it's still got the historical features. They're fitting in with the area. But again, the floor plans that they needed for a working building. And again, on this bottom floor, because all the windows are kind of blocked out, I would imagine it would be an underground chamber. So where all of the underground wires from another telephone exchange would come in to that particular area, and then it would get diverted out. And this is just a little map to kind of show what's underneath our feet and what's, aerial for the telephone poles. So you'd have the exchange in the middle. Then cables would be going out of the telephone exchange to a PCP box. So that would have for the exchange side and then a distribution side as well. That would be fed to your distribution pole. So that's the DP poles. And then that would link up to your house. You'd have a drop wire and then your socket. Now, obviously, early sockets would have not be tampered with. That's the GPO's responsibility, because it was all wired up, particularly with bells. You could really disrupt the network. So again, and these dark bold lines that you see are traffic coming into the telephone exchange, some from different areas and some from different telephone boundaries that were adjoining. And if we have a look at one of my telephones now that I've got in my collection, this particular one has still got the letters around on the dial face, if you so wish. So you've got this letter combination still going on. And you'd have your dial card in the middle there telling you your subscriber's number. So when you picked up the phone, you would clearly say, so they know they got the right number, because that was an issue. A lot of people would misdial because they were very similar, not the same, but very similar. And you've also got a drawer in there that you would keep all of your numbers for the doctor, the family butcher, maybe, and other exchanges as well, potentially. But after the war, they got rid of these drawers because they were an expense. So it's all saving money. The bells were external on a wall set. So they weren't in the telephone at this point. They were up on a wall, and that was really just for the design, taking up less space. But then in the 1950s, you got some of these telephones, which are more recognizable. So this is a Series 300, where the bells came back into the telephone, the bell set, and that was for a desk phone. It was more appealing for subscribers, taking up less room on the wall. And if you were very fortunate, you had had an ivory color, and that celebrated 4 million subscribers in London alone. So that's really, poignant color. And there were different variations of colors, to celebrate certain things at that time. So just to review then, a summary or a plenary, if you so wish, just looking at kind of all those different areas. Some of those area codes you won't know of anymore. So it's all of the sequence of the pattern, if you so wish, of that number. And then in 1947, Postmaster General Wilfred Palin, who was the Postmaster General after the war, many telephone operators couldn't return to work. So the telephone exchanges became almost like recruitment centres, so they could train particularly women, because women were said to have the softer voice for the day duty and the men for the night duty. So they really were, and it was on TV, it was on adverts to try and get telephone operators. And we can see some of these advertising here. So become a post office telephone operator, because, it was, on its knees at this time. The reputation was really suffering. So they had to real good at recruitment. And it was training people. Could they recognize, could they speak clearly, good English? So it's quite hard, but also they needed these operators as well. And then this is quite a famous picture. So this is obviously Queen Elizabeth in 1959, and she inaugurated the first telephone call without the use of an operator. So this is the birth of O1, really, and we can see here on her right, her left, sorry, we've got the Postmaster General, Ernest Marples, and then the Duke of Edinburgh as well on her right. So it did also change the coins as well. So, for example, using a telephone kiosk in there, you would have had that, the area code. All of a sudden, the letters were taken away. So they all reverted back to their former numbers that were already there. But for a subscriber, that was very confusing. And then directory inquiries really started to play a full force in this, because people didn't know where they were calling to. So as I mentioned, that was the first inauguration call, Bristol to the Lord Provost in Edinburgh. So that was on TV, nationalised. And that was the birth of the O1. Birmingham, other big cities started with 0, 1 as well, but with just a 2 or a 3 put in. So again, it was quite a simple rotary, but it was important. The London Borough adopted 4 new areas at this specific time. Why? Not sure. All letters reverted back to their numbers, as I mentioned. Some subscribers got transferred to new exchanges and new numbers. And then this is where we lost some area codes, because we don't need those codes anymore. If they've changed to another nearby telephone exchange, it was a lot more faster. They could process, and they had banks of thousands of Straugers, all of these individual selectors. Some letter codes were dropped, as I have mentioned. Some are still there today. And you will see in your number. And then in 1965, the new dials were introduced by Postmaster General Anthony Benn. And we can see on the left-hand side, we've got a series 700. This was the last telephone really to have the letters round the bezel, because they weren't needed anymore. And then we can see obviously the figures only. 100 was still operator, and it actually still is today. And you can still use the speaking clock. The current speaking clock is Alan Stedman, who got it in 2016. So it's always been a competition right the way through history. But you still got your subscriber's number to speak clearly on the telephone as well. Then in 1990, you got the inner and outer London codes, so the 071 and 081. So that's simply, you still had the 01, but it was just simply either putting a 7 in or an 8 in. And why they did that is to establish the different areas, because actually they found out the area codes were quite useful for a lot of people. So having a particular number would define that as an area as well, and be really helpful. But in 1995, British Telecom came over with a big changeover day, because the numbers weren't particularly running out because the sequence were the same, but adding an extra area code number in would make that number all completely different, because actually on a telephone dial, when you dial, you send out pulses. So if you just make the sequence different, that would, keep them going, if you so wish, for another decade. So an extra 1 was added, so 0171 and 0181. So adding this extra 1, allowing numbers to stay the same. So it was trying to secure the future of telephone numbers to stop running out. Businesses, shop fronts had to change all the signage. Shop fronts got very frustrated. You can tell, because it's costing them a lot of money to keep doing these changes. And then finally in 2000, we got the 020 code, and that really came about because of dial-up across the internet. It was a lot more faster. And then 01 was given to lots of these different surrounding areas outside of London. So actually London is still unified by its own kind of area code, just because of the sheer volume of traffic. And a telephone number below there can kind of give you an idea really of how the telephone number has developed. So you've got your 020, then 7 or 8 stills there because you can't take out a number of a telephone number. It's all in sequence. Even when push button telephones came in, it would still read your number frequency or of that particular digit. So it all had to stay the same, but just putting something in front. So a lot of your area codes, I guarantee you, will still be there in your number in some form. Whether that's changing to another exchange or another area, they will be there. And I found these brilliant photos online. So thank you to Emily Webber for these. And they really show the shop fronts, because if you were passing on a double decker or a route master, having a shop front number, somebody could jot it down, as the bus stopped at the bus stop, it would continue. So you could jot these numbers down, really helpful. So this is an 081. So this would be a 1990s one for this shop front. This particular shop front, you've got the 0171 in 1995, British Telecom big changeover day. And then the dry cleaners, finally, we've got the 020, just again, put on front really. And just to kind of summarize my talk now, I have also got my own directories that I've inherited from people. I've purchased some myself, and the stories are lovely, really, that they contain. So we've got all of these different older codes here. So we've got Primrose Hill, we've got Holborn, Dulliver on this particular one, Terminus. So these are not really what you would hear anymore, but to those back at that time would have been really important. Primrose Hill again there. So you've got it all in capitals. Dulliver. And then those are my references. And really, just to say thank you so much for listening. This particular photo I took at Balham Telephone Exchange, and it's a really nice one. Telephone exchange inquiries, please ring. So thank you very much for your time, everybody, and thank you for listening.
Billy, thank you so very much for giving us such a really thorough overview of what goes on behind the telephone in our area. I'll sort of kick off the questioning just to allow everyone else who has got questions perhaps just to formulate them and also work out best way to get them across to you. So we've got a couple of methods. Now, if you go to there is a bar at the bottom of your screen with a few icons. One of those is a heart that says react. If you press it, you will see that it says raise hand. So you could click on that, very helpful. You can physically raise your hand, and I will try to spot it. Or there is also in that bar at the bottom of the screen a button that says chat. And you're very welcome to post questions on that as well. So that gives people a few options there, just give people a chance. So Billy, yeah, thank you so much. One question from me. I remember sort of, I think I'm still traumatized by it. As a young boy, being out, and it seems very weird looking back, but I was sort of far from home, which probably meant about 20 minutes, no money, and so I went into a phone box. And we'd learned that you could reverse charges. And this was very sort of, very helpful if you didn't have your 2p or your 10p on you. And I got into such trouble for reversing charges later. I mean, because apparently, the cost was astronomical. So could you just give us a bit of an overview of how reverse charges came about, how it worked, why they charge so much? And the key question is, can I still do it?
So yes, you can still use reverse charge, and there's also a lot of others. 118 I believe is still going as well, but the telephone kiosks, as they started to come about, all of them were linked up to their own telephone exchange switching equipment. So that all happened on its own separately. You would pick it up, listen for rapid pips on the telephone, then put your number in. It's 0800 was a free phone number, and that came about really to help people, who can afford. But yes, it would give your user potentially the bill if you use that reverse number. And that, was available in a lot of them, potentially really for emergencies, or if you needed to find, get someone to pick you up from the pub or wherever you were out for the evening.
I mean, did this start right from the earliest days, this concept of reverse charges?
It hasn't always started from the early days. So yes, really, it's I'm not sure in the exact date, but from looking at 999 when that came in 1937, I would assume it would be around a similar time, potentially if you had a priority call coming through.
Oh, lovely. And then just my second question, just perhaps just help everyone really grasp
Or,
what is obviously for you an area of expertise and second nature. So I don't know if you can remember Kentish Town, that's where I live.
right.
You talked about can you remember what the code was?
Not off the top of my head, sorry.
No, okay, well choose one of them. But could you just explain? So before sort of direct dialing, how would I, if I'm trying to phone someone in the Camden area,
Mhm.
just talk through exactly how it would work? I'd pick up the phone,
Sure.
talk to an operator, and then what would I say? Would I say, give me Gulliver 483? Is that how it worked?
So you would obviously use your telephone dial to dial to the exchange. So once you've done that, you would get through to your operator.
In that exchange, that's the key thing, is it?
In that exchange for that area on that switchboard, you'd have to probably wait because there was probably 10 other people trying to phone the same area. So once you phoned through, they would ask, where are you calling? Or you could say, I want to call the person on such and such street, and they could search it up and find that for you. And then they would put you through. So they had one extent jack, if you like, in one part of the switchboard and one to the other to connect the lines. So they were almost a bit like how the wires connected, that sort of bit, and then they would put you through.
Brilliant. Okay, lovely. Okay, so just sort of throwing it open to other questions. We've got one here from Elizabeth. Please, can you give some idea of how the cables were laid during the early years, which would have coincided with electric cables and tube lines, etc.? And she also says, thank you very much for the presentation.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. Yes, so it was particularly the heavy underground was linked up where gas, and other utilities. So that's why at the telephone exchange, they've got these ducts to not let any gas in because the risk of explosion was quite high in those sorts of areas. They would dig boreholes as well in the road. So again, they would have to put it up. And as I mentioned, the London Telephone Service had particular particular regions looking after certain areas. So they would have particularly motorbikes, GPO motorbikes, to get through the city, quick in and out. And then obviously they'd have the large Bedford and Morris vans, Morris utility vans with all of the equipment. So yeah, it'd be a lot of hard labour digging, particularly before. But yes, they did have to be careful. Sometimes they did go through an electrical wire, or the risk of gas explosion might be something. So they really had to, and they had lots of meters that they would take out with them. So hopefully that answers your question, Elizabeth.
Wonderful. I know we do have a hand up, but I'll just do another question from the chat. This one from Sarah. Really appreciated your talk. We're looking for comment here, so I think, an open-ended one for you. Could you comment on the neglected phone boxes on our streets?
Okay, so you're talking about telephone kiosks.
I think this is well, it's called phone boxes. So I think, yes,
Okay, yeah, phone boxes, they were known. So, yes, 1921, the first K1 series was brought out, and then Charles Gilbert Scott brought out in 1924. He won a post office competition to house the K2 as we know. So, the K2 was that one with the big dome, and then we got the variations of the K6, the K8, and it all happened. They were just specifically designed in London first. And then other councils started to take them on. And that's why Hull is a very good example, because they have cream phone boxes. They wanted to do everything their own way. So a lot of different councils painted their telephone boxes different colours. And then a lot of them have now been replaced by the KX100, which is that metal, because disability regulations, could get a wheelchair in there, for example. The phone was easier to reach. So a lot of them did get updated, but you'll be lucky to know that a lot have been preserved, particularly the K2 and some of the K6s as well. So look out for signs on payphones preserved.
I mean, mate, so I think so. Perhaps just broadening the question. I mean, what do you think should happen to all those? So people don't use phone boxes anymore.
Uh,
So unfortunately, no 2Ps or 10Ps, going into slots. What do you think should be done with all the phone boxes? Some people say it's historical, it's architectural legacy, it's an important part of our heritage. Other people, they become places to basically, piss in and put rubbish and, McDonald's wrappers in, So what's your view? What should we
um,
do with all those neglected phone boxes?
Well, a lot of them have been turned into libraries.
Hmm.
A lot of them have been turned into defibrillator stations. So actually, there is a value, absolutely. And, in 1924, I don't think Giles Gilbert Scott appreciated how much, they're up against Big Ben. This is a London icon now. So I think it is really important to save some of them, particularly with the ones that already have been left. And yeah, a lot of them are being preserved. So that's great. And I definitely think for the heritage need to be looked after. So look after phone boxes.
Fabulous, lovely. Eleanor, you had a question. Are you still there, Eleanor? Eleanor, I don't know if you're still with us. Anyone else? Maybe Eleanor will come back to us. Has anyone else got a question? Do physically raise your hand. Do use the raise hand icon.
Where is the raise hand?
Well, you're with us now, so Ruth. So why don't we take your
Oh,
question? You're here in person, and you can
well, I
ask
was going to
away.
say Eleanor is muted at present, which is why she couldn't.
Ah, Eleanor, you're back. I can see.
Yeah.
Eleanor, do you have a question for us?
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, I just had to go and shut some windows because it's just started to rain. Sorry.
What? Rain?
I know. I'm very excited. It's not a question really. I just wanted to thank Billy very much because it was like so interesting for me, so nostalgic, as for many of us, about remembering all the famous numbers. But also because my father worked in telecoms
Right.
all his life from the 1940s to 1980s. And so many things that you said like triggered little memories about stories that he told. So obviously, it was a reserved occupation through the war, so he had lots of stories about maintaining telephone exchanges during the Blitz. And I've got a lot of papers that I inherited, from his career. I mean, is that something that your heritage group might be interested in? I've got some stuff from the Stone Training College that he went to in the mid-40s. Lots of training manuals around new switching equipment that was being developed. And I'm trying to declutter, and I don't want to just bin it, but I don't know if it will be of interest to anybody. I just want
Yes, I'm sure they
whether
definitely will be.
that's something that would be.
Yes, absolutely. There's always somewhere. So don't bin them, definitely. That they will be taken on. And that's something, yeah, they would be particularly interested. So the THG, or the Telecommunication Heritage Group, has got a website.
There we go. It's lovely to know these talks do more than just impart information. They're a
Absolutely.
they're a sort of exchange forum as well. Lovely. Last call for any questions before I.
Uh, sorry,
Yes,
yes.
Ruth.
Were all the telephone codes, telephone codes for all of Greater London area, all the O1 numbers, uh, allotted to all the inner London? Were they all in inner London, all these telephone exchanges? Because I noticed that, for example, Ewell was assigned to, was it the Euston
Yes.
exchange? So were they all allotted to?
Euston was an interesting one because in Epsom, Surrey, where I come from, they had a trial. So that was for an automated trial.
Oh, so that was just an unusual one, was it?
Yeah, so they did the trial in 1924. Just trial it out, could it work to Surrey? So that's why it's included. So Euston is a very individual one, an
Right.
exception to the rule, if you so wish.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
No, you're welcome.
Lovely. Well, okay, Billy. Thank you again, once again, for coming and sharing so passionately something that obviously means such a lot to you. As I said, I think you've really struck a nostalgic chord with so many, and I think probably it should be sort of compulsory viewing for anyone under the age of about 20 who doesn't understand what a phone is. I think my son wouldn't have a clue. But as you said, your phone number, your first phone number is one that you never forget, ironically. So again, thank you ever so much. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you to all of our audience who've, come out on this steamy, hot, muggy night. It's been great to see everyone. All the best.